Hi, this is Dr. Preek, and here's just a little smidge of information about same-sex relationships, how the relationship quality seems to be similar to, whoops, that happens, or different from other relationships. So one thing I want to make clear when we talk about relationship quality, historically there have been a lot of findings touted that same-sex relationships are less stable, less long-lasting, and thus, if those are things you really value, less valuable than other sex relationships. So I want to point out from the beginning that there are barriers faced by same-sex relationships, by people in same-sex relationships. One is that there is not just social danger, including things like getting fired or getting kicked out of your housing, but there's also physical danger in expressing your relationship. I personally know individuals who have been assaulted in public by strangers for being identifiably LGBTQIA. And so it's important to note that there may be places where it is not, where a couple does not feel safe holding hands or kissing or making clear that they are in a relationship. There also may be different levels of out. So someone may be out to their family and friends, but not out at work or not out. And something seems silly, but you have landlords, neighbors, professors, all sorts of different people who have influence over your life. And so when you think of relationships, it's not just completely hidden away in the closet or completely out in the open. There's a lot of different layers of coming out. And that also means you have to come out a lot of times. Coming out is not a single process. It also may be difficult if the two different members of the relationship have different levels of being out. So if one person is out to their family and the other person is not, that can create a difficulty in the relationship. And there's lots of other complications because people may come from different, family cultures, cultural backgrounds, religions. They may be in different fields of work that have different values. And so for some people, it may be a lot riskier to be out than for others. In general, same-sex relationships have traditionally had less social support than other gender relationships. And in many ways, this is changing, but there is still a strong heteronormative bias, meaning the general assumption when you meet someone is that they are straight, and that if they're in a relationship, it's with someone of the other sex. And so even with all the progress that's been made in recent decades, starting off with just legalizing same-sex relationships and then legalizing same-sex marriages, there's still not as much social support. And again, there's a lot of differences in different parts of the country. And when you think globally, there are some places that are much more accepting, and there are other places where it is still very much against the law to be in a same-sex relationship and may even be punishable by death legally. And we also know that there are still murders of same-sex individuals, and although it's not quite the same issue, we know that trans individuals, particularly trans women, are killed at very high rates. Last but not least, there are stereotypes and assumptions. And so even people who are broadly supportive of same-sex relationships may have a lot of stereotypes, may assume a lot of things about the relationship. And so there's just a lot of barriers, a lot of kind of heaviness that a couple has to navigate and hoops to jump through just to get to the starting line that most heterosexual couples start with. It kind of reminds me, and I forget what all are in these slides. I might talk about it later. I'm sorry. But a friend of mine who is married to a woman, had a child around the same time I did. And we had worked together a couple years before and had talked. We were kind of both in the, are we having kids? How is that working phase? And so then we ended up having children just a few months apart from each other. And about 6 months later, after her daughter was born, she posted that the adoption had been finalized for her wife to legally adopt their child. And she had said that prior to that, every time she drove in bad weather, and she lives in Minnesota, so that was a lot. But every time she had driven through bad weather or had anything, she was always a little panicky about whether her wife would face legal issues with retaining custody of their daughter if she died, because my friend is the one who biologically carried and birthed the child. So she talked about the amount of, first of all, that's a very stressful experience, but also she talked about the extra time, effort, and money, the thousands of dollars that they had to pay to get the same basic rights that my spouse and I had with our child from the moment he was born, and potentially even prior to being born. So there's a lot of, just to kind of get to the same starting line, there are a lot of extra things to navigate that are very real and would affect, if nothing else, the stress level and the amount of potential conflict in a relationship. So it does seem that there are some differences. Again, there kind of historically there have been a lot of stereotypes that, or myths, some of which were suggested through research that same-sex relationships didn't last as long or were not as monogamous as other sex relationships. And so if that's your measuring stick for a good relationship, it looks like they're worse relationships. There's been some work into the gendered expectations for lesbians and gay men. So in a heterosexual relationship, there are a lot of expectations in general about what women do and what men do in a relationship. And so one of the interesting things with same-sex relationships is there's not automatically that gender role assignment. In general, it seems that lesbians get a lot more pushback societally about who's the man in the relationship. But you can follow these links for more information, because again, you can get to this slideshow in the Google Drive. I may link to it in Blackboard somewhere as well. In general, there's some research that suggests that that same-sex couples may have a better conflict style, a better way of working through conflict. And I linked to a lot of great resources from the Gottman Institute about conflict and working through conflict. It seems that in the couples that have been studied, they start discussing the conflict. They kind of go in a little more lightly. They used more humor and kind of affection along the way. They were less defensive, and they had less physical arousal. So their heart rate didn't go up as much. Their breathing rate didn't go up as much. They didn't sweat as much. So they seemed to just kind of be a little more calm and playful throughout. And you can read the article, and I think I may have assigned these. I don't remember. You can read the article to get a little more detail, but part of what they were saying was that this kind of cycle of demand and withdraw that we see, the kind of some of the negative conflict styles that we see in heterosexual couples, which for most of the history of couples research was couples. So again, side note, it's really important to recognize when a population is defined incorrectly. So if you say couples, but you only mean monogamous heterosexual couples, there's some bias. If you also kind of imply white or imply American to anything, it's problematic when you talk about it as a universal experience. So what we find is that what we kind of thought of as these gendered patterns of conflict, when you have two people of the same gender identity, you don't necessarily see the same pattern showing up. And so one possibility is that it's about the power. It's not just that women tend to do this and men tend to do that naturally, but we know in the US and in most parts of the world, men have more power societally. And so it may be more about that power dynamic than about inherent gender characteristics. Of course, it's possible that there may be differences in gender identity for people who are same sex. This also, I'm aware as I'm looking at this, there's really no space to talk about people who identify as gender non-binary or fluid. And I don't know that either any of this material talks about trans individuals who can be either gay or straight. So I can, if I'm a trans woman, I may be attracted to other women, I may be attracted to men. So it's just a teeny tiny bit of information, but it's kind of what stood out to me and what seemed interesting about the idea of kind of what we know currently about differences in same-sex relationships versus other sex relationships. Thanks.